You're listening to the Joyous Podcast with Mike Carden, where we talk to the world's most interesting business thinkers about life and work and life. For show notes and other content referenced in this podcast, visit joyoushq.com/podcast. And now, here's Mike.
Hello, welcome to the Joyous Podcast, where we talk work and making work great. I'm Mike Carden, co-founder of Joyous, and my guest today is, drumroll please, the GOAT of positioning. Now, I didn't make that up myself. I read that on the internet. But April Dunford, welcome to the show, April.
Oh, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's great. Hey, I'm excited about this. You're the author of two books on positioning for, I guess, for B2B tech companies. Seriously Awesome, which is, it's just one of those seminal books if you're in the world of tech, particularly early stage tech, and probably one of the books I recommend most often when people come to me asking me questions. And then of course more recently Sales Pitch. I think that the subtitle is that how to craft a story to stand out and win. So why did you write those books, April?
I don't know. Boredom. No, well, the books, if somebody had told my high school self that later on in life I would be a book writer, I think I would have told you you're nuts, because that was not something I had on my bingo card. But I spent a good amount of time as a repeat vice president of marketing, working at a series of venture-backed startups. And one of the things that became a specialty of mine across my career was positioning. So I launched a lot of new products. I did a lot of repositioning on products that were in the market and not doing so great. And then we repositioned them to try to unlock some growth. And then about 7-8 years ago, I made the switch to doing consultings. And so what I do now is I work with growing technology companies and I help them on their positioning and how to take that positioning and translate it into a good story that they can use in marketing and sales to sell the stuff. And so after I had been consulting for 3 or 4 years, I got the idea that, there's a methodology that I use for this. And it would be cool if I wrote it down and then people could look at it and decide whether or not they wanted to work with me. Like you either buy it or you don't. And it started out as a blog post, and then it got too long to be a blog post. And then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do a book. So that's where the first book, obviously awesome, the positioning book, came from. And then after I wrote that book, I had an assumption that people knew how to build a sales pitch out of their positioning. I kind of assumed that was a previously solved problem. And in the 3-4 years of working with companies after I wrote the first book, it became clearer to me that people didn't actually have a process for building a good sales pitch. And it was also apparent to me that if we did the positioning work, and we didn't do a good job of turning it into a pitch, then the positioning would never survive the jump from marketing to sales. So I thought, okay, fine, one more book. And that was this one, Sales Pitch, which is very specifically designed to give you a structure for building a good sales pitch that helps you answer the question, why pick us over the other guys? So that's it. That's how I got here.
So you very nonchalantly said there you'd done a few roles as VPs of marketing in early stage businesses. How did take us through the kind of April Dunford origin story? So how did you get to that point?
Yeah, that was kind of a winding road. I mean, I didn't start out to be a VP marketing. It was one of these weird things where what I really wanted to be when I was in high school was a doctor. So I thought I'd be a doctor. I'm the smart kid, top of my class in high school. I thought, well, we'll go to med school. And so I did pre-med and applied to med school. And while I was sitting on the wait list to get into this med school I wanted to get into, I had kind of an epiphany that I was like, why do I want to go to med school? Like, I think what if I'm a bad doctor? I might actually kill people, and I started overthinking this decision. And I happened to be doing my pre-med at the University of Waterloo, which is a very well-known school in Canada for engineering and computer science. And I had always been quite into tech. Like, I was a good programmer in high school. And I was like, you know what? I should have went into tech. Like, that's what I should have done. And so I ended up making the switch, and I switched into systems design engineering. and did that. And then when I graduated, I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to, like the role I was going to do. I knew I wanted to work in tech, but I didn't know what the role was. And so I came out and I got a job as a product marketer at a company that sold database products. And what they wanted was somebody that knew a bit about databases and could write queries in structured query language, but also was not afraid to speak in public at the trade show. And so I got the job because I had both those things. That company ended up getting acquired by a big company in San Francisco. And shortly after, my boss quit the company and they made me the vice president of marketing, which is hysterical because I didn't know anything about marketing. And then I managed to bluff my way through that job for a year or bit. And then I decided, well, this is it. This is my jam. I'm the vice president of marketing now. And then I just never looked back. That was that. I mean, once they give you the job once, you're good. Like you can just keep doing it as long as you don't mess up too badly.
So you're kind of this unicorn of public speaking and SQL. It's
That's what got me the job. SQL, unafraid to speak in public. There wasn't a lot of people in my class in engineering that, like, we all ticked the SQL box, but there weren't that many. Like, public speaking was not the thing. Like in all of the group projects in engineering where somebody had to stand up and do the presentation, I was the person that stood up and did the presentation.
It makes sense. I feel I've been there as well. Hey, so in this, I mean, as I understand it, you kind of start to develop your theory of positioning in those VP of marketing roles. Yeah. Do you want to just talk us through, both how that develops and then,
sure,
the postage stamp version of what that is?
Yeah. So the very first product that I ever worked on was kind of a failure. So it had been conceived as desktop productivity software, and it didn't work out. We had it on the website. We were trying to sell it. Some people bought it, but then didn't use it for anything. And so it was kind of a failure. And we were thinking about killing it. And instead, we took the product and repositioned it for a different use case to a different buyer for a different kind of a company, and it took off. And not only did it take off, it ended up being spectacularly successful. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, I thought, wow, like, isn't that neat? Pretty much the same product. We just talked about it in a different way and packaged it up differently and put different pricing on it and sold it in a different way. And it went from being a total failure to a thing that, eventually was making hundreds of millions in revenue. And so I thought, well, this is like a magic trick. Like if we could figure out how to do this, like that'd be a cool thing to know how to do. And so then I discovered that is called positioning. And I thought, well, there must be a way to do this. Like we must have a methodology for doing positioning. So I went and had lots of coffee meetings with smart marketers and, read all the books, took some classes. And what I discovered is that positioning is a really foundational, fundamental marketing concept. But at the time, there didn't seem to be an accepted process or methodology to actually do it. Like if you had something that was in the market and you wanted to tighten up the positioning, nobody could tell me how to do that. Everybody had a way that they kind of did it themselves. Like a good VP marketing would say, well, here's what I do, but a lot of it didn't sound very repeatable and it was all very context specific. And that bugged me. Like the little engineer in me was like, no, I want to know, like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, how do we do it? And so after a while, I thought, well, okay, that doesn't exist, but that should exist. And maybe we can't figure that out for any kind of business. But if it was a B2B tech company, there's enough commonality there that I think we could figure it out. And I worked on that for a bunch of years. And I started by looking at it and saying, well, could we break positioning down into component pieces? Because this is how we solve problems in engineering. We're going to break things down into pieces, figure out the pieces and then smash them together. And so I started by breaking positioning down into 5 component pieces. So there's first of all, there's competitive alternatives. If you didn't exist, what would a customer do? And that's what we have to position against in the minds of customers. Two, there's differentiated capabilities, which is like, what can you do that the other alternatives can't? And the third piece is differentiated value. Like customers don't actually care about your features. They care about what the features can deliver for their business. So what's the value you can deliver that no one else can? And then four, in B2B, we're not trying to sell to everybody. We're trying to sell to a certain kind of customer that's a really good fit for our stuff. So what's the profile of a good fit customer that we can go sell to? And then lastly, the last piece is market category, which is kind of like, are you a database or a business intelligence tool? Where is the starting point for us to have a conversation with a customer about what we are? And then once you break it into those parts, it becomes clear that the pieces all have a relationship to each other. For a long time, I wrestled with this. Like if you look at differentiated value, the value that you can deliver that no other product can is completely dependent on your differentiated capabilities. So I can't figure out one without knowing the other, but the differentiated capabilities are only differentiated when you compare them to a competitor. So those things are all related. And then a best fit customer is a customer that cares a lot about your value. So I can't figure that out until I know what my value is. And then market category is kind of like the context you position a product in such that your value kind of makes sense to these customers. So really everything has a relationship to everything else. And it took me a while to figure out the order of operations. Like where do we start and how do we move along? And eventually I landed on the idea that we have to start with competitive alternatives. We have to start with the thing that we got to compare ourselves to. If we don't, then what we end up with is positioning that sounds good in the office, but I take it out to the market and it doesn't work because I'm not sufficiently differentiated from all the other things that a customer could buy. So once I got there, then the whole thing started to be pretty easy. We could start by saying, well, if we didn't exist, what would a customer do? And then we could look at, okay, well, what have we got that those solutions don't have? Make a list of those things. And then I could translate those things into value and say, this is the value we can deliver, no one else can. And then once I have that value, then I can say, okay, well, who cares a lot about that value? And that's how I'd figure out a best fit customer. And then lastly, I got market category. I got this value, trying to explain it to these people. Am I a database or a business intelligence tool? And so the first book that I wrote, Obviously Awesome, is the book that describes this process and how you might get a team of people together inside the company to work through those steps to really crack into this is what the positioning should be. That's my 5-minute description of a thing that took me like 6 years to figure out.
Well, that's the best thing, though, isn't it? If you can boil it down to 5 minutes, you're winning, aren't you?
Yeah,
I think it's an interesting thing to me, right? In that, I guess I had a similar trajectory in that, I worked in marketing roles for a long time. I've ridden the fashion of marketing in tech. In fashion is out of fashion is in fashion again,
yes.
And I think that that simple statement you made there, like what would the customer do if we didn't exist? That is the crux of it, because I think a lot of early stage companies let their ego kind of get in the way. And I mentioned this earlier on that I have recommended your book often, and that's because I'll talk to people who'll come to me just being a person who's had some success in the SaaS world, and they'll say, oh, look, we've got this product, and and I'll kind of go into those sort of statements about, okay, how does it fit in the market and so on. And their sort of response is, well, this is completely new. No one's done this before. And so as soon as you get into the mode of going, okay, well, what makes you different in the mind of the customer and so on, they get very, very tied in knots because they believe they have something unique. What's your opinion on that school of thought? Because it's a big one.
Yeah. I mean, in B2B, if you think about it, a lot of the stuff that we're selling, if you think about how the customer is solving the problem today, because let's face it, they have the problem today. Like if you're going to go in and sell to them, and they are doing something about that problem today. It might not be using a thing that looks like you at all. It might be we're doing it with manual process, like pen and paper, or we're doing it with a spreadsheet, or we're doing it with some monolith software we have, like our ERP or our accounting system, and we're making it work, but it was never meant to be to do that thing. And so at a minimum, you've got that competition. So it is not a smart thing to go in and say, we don't have any competition. We don't have to. At a minimum, you've got to convince the customer that the pain of changing away from doing this manually or doing this with a spreadsheet is worth it. And and so you're selling against status quo. You're also selling against the uncertainty of change.
Exactly.
The second thing is that often companies will come to me and they'll say, well, this thing it's really different. It's really different. It's this brand new thing. No one's ever seen anything like it. And sometimes that's true. It's a new, there's a whole new category of solutions that are emerging, and there's, nothing that looks like that. But often a customer would look at it and say, it's a little bit different, man, but it's basically the same thing as this other thing. And so tell me why I shouldn't pick this other thing. So I don't think it does companies a lot of, I don't think it's good for companies to trick themselves into thinking their thing is such a special snowflake that there's nothing like it out there. What we really have to do is put ourselves in the shoes of a customer and say, what would a customer do if we didn't exist? And if a customer is out trying to make a purchase, what are we replacing? And what else ends up on the short list? And those things might not look like us. We don't want to think about them as competition. But if they're landing on a short list with us, then they absolutely are. And we're going to have to answer the question, why pick us over that?
Well, in fact, in sales pitch, you even say, don't you, that unless the customer has a set of competitive choices, it's actually harder for them to make a decision, right? So if I don't have something to compare it to, it's hard for me to make a decision. Yeah,
it is. It is. Like, there's this kind of, sometimes you'll see with marketing people, there's a little bit of this magical thinking that they'll say, well, if we come in and say we're this totally different thing, then we've just eliminated all the competition. There's no more competition out there. We're building a whole new market and there's no competition. But often that's just not the way customers look at the market. And so you can be out there saying that, but the customers aren't stupid and they still come in and say, yeah, you're saying it's different, but but you look just like a CRM. You do the same thing as a CRM. So I'm going to compare you to CRM things. And yeah, you call it something different, but we know what it is.
yeah. This magical thinking you just described it as. I'm going to borrow that one. Yeah, look, I think the other thing too is that you've got to be good at talking to customers. And I talked last week to Rob Fitzpatrick, who wrote the Mom Test, right?
Oh, he's so great, isn't he? I love this book. I love him and his thinking, and that book is great. Everybody doing a new startup should read that book.
I totally agree. In fact, I'm often, it's like, read Absolutely Awesome and read the Mom Test. In fact, I made that recommendation to someone just yesterday, literally on their new startup. So look, I'm interested, and this is a little bit of the topic of the new book, I guess, but the bit where I think people get tied up in knots as well is the difference between positioning and messaging. So, I feel like in my early career in marketing, I kind of arrived at positioning through messaging, almost clumsily and almost by mistake, but because
most people confuse the two.
Yeah. So what's the difference between those two?
I think this was a big unlock for me in the early stages of my marketing career because I didn't think there was any difference between messaging and positioning. So I thought positioning was just the words we use to communicate what the value is. But if we think about it, like if you came to me and said, April, I got this product and, we're building a new homepage and we need some messaging on the homepage to talk about it. I would ask you a bunch of questions about that. I'd say, okay, good. Let's write this stuff for the homepage. But first, I got some stuff that you got to define for me. So who do we compete with and how do we win? So you would have to tell me who's my competitor? How are we different? What's the value we can deliver that the competitors can? And oh, by the way, I'm writing this message for someone. So what's the persona of the person we sell to? What does that company look like that we're trying to sell to? And what exactly is the market we're trying to win here? I would need to know that stuff before I could write any words on the page. And so I see positioning as a fundamental input to messaging. Like we need to answer these questions first, and then we can go write the messaging. So this is what got me thinking that positioning was so foundational. Like often I was trying to write messaging, and then I'd go back to the CEO, and the CEO would say, Well, no, we're selling to vice president of sales, and the vice president of sales doesn't care about that. But then I would go to, like the head of product, and the head of product would say, oh, we're not actually selling to the vice president of sales. We actually sell to the ops manager, and that's different. And I'm like, well, how am I supposed to write messaging if we can't even agree who we're trying to sell to? And then I'd be asking questions like, all right, so I'm trying to write value propositions. What's the value we deliver? And I get one answer from people in marketing, a different answer from people in sales, a different answer from the CEO or the sales reps. And I'm like, we need to get an agreement on that before I can go write the pretty words to represent this thing. Conceptually, we need to understand what our differentiated value is. So once I get my head around that, then I was like, well, we need to figure out this positioning separately. And then once we have the positioning, that positioning serves as an input to a lot of things. It serves as an input to messaging on the homepage, but that's not the only place we use messaging. We have different messaging in campaigns. We have different messages. If I'm writing a brochure, I'm writing other things. It's all this messaging gets used in different places. And then we also, if we have a sales team, we need a sales pitch, which is how do we tell the story if I'm sitting across from a good fit prospect that knows a little bit about our stuff, but not too much. So I need to be able to weave this positioning into a story as well. So in my opinion, positioning is kind of this foundational set of things that we need as the foundation for everything we're going to do in marketing and sales. We figure that out first, and then we're going to take that positioning as an input to build the sales pitch, to go build messaging, to go build messaging for campaigns or anything else we're trying to do.
So look, there's an intersection going on here, I guess, isn't there, between this bit of understanding the positioning so that you're really clear on what value you're adding to customers and how that value is differentiated. And then I guess good old-fashioned storytelling, right? That's sort of psychologically privileged nature of storytelling. And to an extent, to me, and I don't want to oversimplify sales pitch as a tome, but it's a little bit about that, isn't it? It's about taking the positioning and then kind of weaving it into stories that customers can understand.
It is and it isn't. So one of the things that I find really interesting is that when you talk about storytelling, like, we're going to do storytelling, there's a couple of things that we need to think about. So one is most of the storytelling frameworks that we know are stories that were built for entertainment. So if we think about Hero's Journey, which is the classic storytelling framework that everybody talks about, it's the idea that I'm gonna use that framework for a story that I tell to you. I'm talking at you, or I've got a movie, or I'm writing a book. But there's no conversation that goes on in this storytelling for the most part. That is not what we do in sales. So in sales, we are definitely educating a customer, and a good sales pitch does a lot to educate a customer. But we are also being educated by the customer in a good sales pitch too, because we're doing discovery. We're trying to figure out what their constraints are, what other things they're considering. So in my opinion, I think a sales pitch is a very particular kind of a story. It is a story that is designed to allow a salesperson to do everything they need to do, which includes doing discovery with the client, handling their objections, building a rapport with the client, but also teaching the client a little bit about our perspective on the world and the way we think a good informed purchaser should think. And so sales pitch, the book, the way I have it, is a structure that maybe doesn't look anything like what a marketer would normally think of as a storytelling structure, because it is designed to accomplish all of these things in a situation where it's not just me talking to you. We're actually having a back and forth with a client, and we have a very specific set of things we're trying to get done in this situation. So that's the way I come at it.
Interesting.
We still need to represent our positioning. Our positioning is a fundamental input to this stuff, but it isn't about, like we're not writing Star Wars here. Like I'm trying to craft a narrative structure that allows a good sales rep to have a conversation with a prospect that ultimately answers the question, why should you pick us over the other guys?
Yeah, I use a call recorder, like an AI note taker on my pitching now. And it's the most revelatory part of that is, well, there's two parts to it. One is that I can see what percentage of the time I talked. And if the percentage of the time I talked is 70% or anything north of 50%, something's wrong with my storytelling as far as the way you describe it there is.
Well, I'll tell you something, that the data on that is pretty interesting. So we have, since the beginning of selling, had an assumption that the customer should be talking more than us in a sales situation. But there is actually some pretty interesting data on this. It comes from this book called The Jolt Effect by this guy, Matthew Dixon. But they analyzed 2.5 million sales calls using AI, and then they looked at what happened after the sales call. Like, so did we ultimately successfully close the deal, or did we not? And it turned out that the most successful sales reps actually do talk a little bit more than the customer does. And part of that is they're guiding the customer. Part of that is they're doing a lot of active listening and agreeing with the customer. But the data tells us that a really good sales conversation, the salesperson is actually taking control of that conversation. There's absolutely a back and forth. That we don't want the sales rep to be doing 100% of the talking. But we don't necessarily have to have, it's not necessarily better that the customer is doing all the talking. Because if the customer is doing all the talking, then what value are we adding in this conversation at all? We're not adding a lot. And so what the data actually tells us is it's actually all right if a salesperson talks more than the customer. It's more about what is happening in that conversation. Is the salesperson guiding the person along on a journey, or is the salesperson just sitting there like an order taker saying, what do you want? What are your problems? What do you do? What's all your stuff? Which, if that's all we were there to do, then why do we have salespeople at all? You should just be selling that stuff zero touch on the website. If there's no reason, if the customer doesn't have information they're trying to get out of the salesperson, then I would question why the salesperson is there at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. And certainly, if you look at those models which are maybe fashionable over the last decade, like challenger selling and so on, it does actually require you to
exactly
stimulate the prospect to think, right? And you don't stimulate the prospect to think without doing something.
And we know that works. Like the data tells us that works much better than the classical solution selling or whatever, when the rep just comes in and says, like a therapy session, like, tell me your problems and I'll just write them all down. And then I will attempt to tell you how our stuff perfectly fits that. What works a lot better is a back and forth with the customer that, where we are painting a picture of the whole market and saying, look, like we kind of look at the market like this, and we've seen a lot of customers just like you. And here's what we see. Do you agree with this? Does that line up with what you've experienced?
It's a little bit, from a storytelling perspective, it's a little bit like a choose your own adventure, isn't it? It's like, you have a bunch of different paths that folk will go down, and you kind of like will work out which path they're going down. One of the best pieces of advice actually I was given early in my kind of selling career was that you actually need to show some weakness as well. You actually need to, as a salesperson, be able to say, hey, I don't actually know everything. So I'm going to just change topics completely here for a second. And look, when we talk about positioning, we often think about it from the impact it has externally. How you're positioning the business externally, how you're talking to customers, and so on. But does positioning have an impact on employees? Is getting positioning important for that internal piece?
This is a great question. When I started doing this work, back when I was in-house, I started with this idea, like this positioning stuff is a marketing thing. Like, but marketing needs to figure it out, and then it impacts the marketing stuff. And then, it became clear to me, well, it's a sales thing too, man, because if the salespeople don't understand it, then they're not going to use it. And they're not, we're going to have one thing we're saying in marketing and we're saying something completely different in sales. And then it became clear to me that on the product side of the house, where they were thinking about the roadmap and where we were going, product needed to understand where we were today and how we were winning in the market today in order to look at, well, how do we get from here to where our ultimate vision for the product is going to be? And then, of course, you have the wild card of things like, a founder who occasionally gets dragged into a sales meeting or whatever. And then who knows what that person is saying. And it would be great if we were all saying the same thing. In my opinion, a good positioning exercise is a cross-functional one. So we're bringing together marketing, sales, product, customer success, the founders together to develop the positioning. And then part of what's great about that is not only are we getting the input from all these different teams, but once we've developed the positioning, then all the different team heads really understand it and then can then take that back to the company so that people inside the company understand the answer to the question, like, how do we win deals today? So I think it's really important that the company understands the positioning at every step in your journey from here to where you're going to your ultimate vision for what you want the product to be in the future. I'm a big believer in cross-functional teams to work on positioning stuff. I used to think of at the beginning of my career, I thought, well, this is just a marketing team and marketing just needs to concern themselves with this. But the more work I do on this stuff, the more I think that it's really a cross-functional effort and everybody needs to get it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, at Joyous, one of our beliefs is that the frontline know the most about customers and competition. Yeah, they know more than anyone else. And
salespeople know way more than anybody else. And it's remarkable to me how little they get pulled into stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously anyone that's worked in sales knows this, that when you're in front of a customer or in front of a prospect, you are honing messaging all the time. You are honing the way you think about the product. You're honing the way you think about the competition and so on all the time in the kind of pressure environment that creates great outcomes that don't actually often happen to marketers. I'm saying this from a position as a long-term marketer. It's like it's that front line where you actually get the pressure that forces you to really think about your differentiation, and so on. You kind of mentioned the 5 pillars or 5 columns of the way that you think about getting to a positioning. And I've heard you talk sometimes about this kind of 6th idea of sometimes it's useful to attach yourself to a trend as well, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes there's a trend and that allows you to kind of cut through. And I'm going to ask the topic du jour question at the moment is every single B2B SaaS I see is jumping on the fact that they're the trend, that they're AI or generative AI powered. Yeah. And good or bad, what do you think?
Well, here's the way AI is definitely the trend that's happening right now, but we've seen this movie before. I mean, there was I'm old enough to remember when things were all on-prem and then we had to shift to the cloud and that was a big thing and everything was going to go to the cloud and oh my gosh, everything was going to be different there. Here's the way I like to look at it. Often hooking onto a trend in your positioning can help you answer the question, why now? Like, why is this important right now? Why should a customer be taking action on this right now? Often what we've got with a trend, and AI, I think very much sits in this, is that we have this kind of what feels like a big step in capabilities. Like, we used to only be able to do this stuff, and now all of a sudden we can do this stuff. And that really changes the possibilities of what our product could do. But for the most part, existing technology companies are not AI companies. They're a company that does accounting or a company that does CRM or a company that does, invoicing software or something, and they are using AI to deliver more value, better value for customers. So we don't just stop being accounting software and say, well, now we're AI software. That's generally not how it works. But the addition of AI technology and capabilities in that software is going to allow us to deliver either more of the value we were already delivering or a different value that we couldn't deliver before we had those capabilities. Often, if we are, if that is the case, then should our positioning change at all is the question. And often the answer is not really. Because again, customers don't care about how the value gets done. They care about the value that you can deliver. Except, and then I will give you the big exception, except when we're in the early days of a big stepwise change in technology like we're seeing right now with AI, often what you'll have is the customers, particularly bigger customers, will be very worried about falling behind. So they'll say, man, like, maybe we need an AI strategy in this business. Like maybe we need to make sure that we're taking full advantage of this AI thing because our competitors might do that. And so even though you sell CRM software or accounting software, you walk in the door to have this meeting with the customer and the customer's like, give me your AI strategy. And so you may find great value in leaning into the AI stuff in the short term while the customers are really panicking about it and thinking about, man, we got to get on the AI thing. And so you better have an AI story when you come in. Otherwise, they're going to be like, well, my job here is to get on the AI stuff. But I generally, my experience with this is that only lasts for a certain period of time. And then what happens is everybody's got the AI, everybody's jumping on it. It's just a given. And we go back to caring, the customers go back to caring about what's the value you can deliver. Oh, you do that with AI? Whatever. I don't care how you do it, just as long as you can do it. So, obviously from a product perspective, we want our product teams to be taking advantage of AI and whatever. How much we pull it out in marketing depends on where customers are at and how important it is for customers at this moment. And we should be watching it to make sure that we're not over rotating at it at a time when, right now it's potentially a differentiator. A year from now, it might not be.
Yeah, that's a good point. Hey, so just to close this out, you wrote the first book almost reluctantly, right? It's like you kind of want to, take a blog post, you turn it into a book. It becomes kind of the seminal book on positioning. Let's face it, right? It's like the standard book. Then you kind of decide that you need to, you've got that missing piece, right, of translating from the messaging to the sales pitch.
Yeah.
Is that it, or is there another book? Like how does what happens? It's like childbirth. I've stopped it too.
I think this is it. Mike, I think 2 books is enough. I don't know if I know anything else. I don't think I know anything else. I think this is it. I think this is, I'm at the age where I'm trying to get all the good stuff that's in my brain. I'm trying to squeeze it out of there and put it somewhere so I can leave that behind. And then, at some point I'm going to stop working and you all are on your own. And so, I think 2 books is enough. I think I'm done with it.
Well, thank you, April, for getting all of that stuff out of your head onto paper so you can share it. And thank you very much too for joining the show. It's really been fabulous having you on. So thank you again, April, and goodbye to you and to everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
This has been the Joyous Podcast, brought to you by Joyous, human conversations and AI analytics in one. Find out more at joyoushq.com. If you liked this show, make sure to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of the Joyous Podcast was hosted by Mike Carden and produced by Kai Crow. Thanks for joining us. And remember, everyone deserves to be joyous.